We've been very positively surprised by Brazil in terms of the resiliency of growth, in terms of the pace of falling inflation, and in terms of the timing of when the central bank might start lowering benchmark interest rates. So for quick context, Brazil suffered an inflationary pressure due to reopening after the pandemic that was far worse than the rest of the world. During the pandemic, the Brazil Central Bank significantly lowered benchmark interest rates from teens to almost 0%, and this is in order to protect the economy, just as the Federal Reserve did in the US. Coming out of the pandemic, however, we saw Brazil suffer inflation that was meaningfully higher than that of the rest of the world. For example, in the US, we saw high single digits in terms of CPI. In Brazil, CPI rose to double digits. To combat inflation, Brazil's central bank massively raised interest rates from 2% to 13.75% by the second half of 2022. Now, this raised a lot of concern because the market was afraid that this would not only snuff out growth, but potentially cause a credit crunch for consumers and for businesses. On top of this, there was noise around presidential elections. There was a lot of skepticism around fiscal discipline. So the market was very, very pessimistic on the outlook for Brazil. However, what actually happened in the first half of this year was that Brazil's inflation came meaningfully lower. And as a result of that, real growth was very positive within Brazil. We saw three areas with particularly strong and quality growth within Brazil's: travel, e-commerce, and software. Within travel, when the rest of the world saw travel grow because of rising prices in airfares and in hotels, in Brazil, not only did pricing increase, but volumes actually increased as well for both international and domestic travel within Brazil. Within e-commerce, what we saw in the rest of the world was that there was a step back for many companies because of pull-ahead ordering during the pandemic. However, within Brazil, the leading e-commerce companies invested in logistics such that delivery became faster, and today it still becomes meaningfully cheaper over time. Within software, during the pandemic, what we saw was that customer retention actually hit historical highs for these software companies within Brazil. But after the pandemic ended, there was permanent customer adoption for new cloud-based software modules. If inflation starts coming down in Brazil, nominal growth in Brazil might start coming down meaningfully. However, in this situation, we think that for many of these sectors, real growth will likely sustain. In the second half of this year, we think that Brazil can become a particularly attractive market for equity investors, especially in those industries that have stayed resilient during the pandemic and for those industries that have improved themselves coming out of the pandemic. The opportunity could be even more attractive for dollar-based investors and global-based investors. The reason is that if you take a look, the Brazilian reais has actually already appreciated 10% this year. When you look at the US and Europe, we're still in a rising interest rate environment. China has suffered growth setbacks because of a confidence trap. Meanwhile, in Brazil, you have resilient businesses in an environment with falling inflation rates and where the central bank is on the verge of cutting interest rates.